Today, we're looking at the sources you've sent in, the intel reports, policy analyses, security forecasts, and they all seem to be pointing to one single urgent question for 2025.
They really are.
And it's not just about the war in Ukraine anymore, is it? It's about this seismic shock that's been created by the U.S. administration's push for an immediate kind of imposed peace settlement.
Exactly. The pressure is on, and the fallout is landing squarely on Europe's doorstep. That's really the context for this deep dive.
Right.
The core sources are trying to map out the consequences of this really abrupt shift. They're forcing us to look at the two-year security outlook specifically for Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, what we call CC.
And we have, what, three main scenarios?
Three distinct endgame scenarios, yeah. A U.S.-dictated settlement, a collapse of Ukrainian resistance, or, the grinding reality of a protracted war.
So our mission today is to figure out what all of that means for you. What happens to NATO's eastern flank, to the internal politics of these frontline states? I mean, the baseline is still a long war, but this instability from Washington, it makes those worst-case scenarios feel much more plausible now. Okay, let's start with the catalyst for all this. The U.S. administration's decision to pivot. It seems remarkable that Washington is prioritizing this so heavily, even potentially normalizing ties with Russia over solidarity with a partner.
It's a purely strategic calculus, really. It's all focused on the global stage.
Kinda.
It's all about China. The U.S. administration sees this strategic competition with China as the overwhelming priority. The Ukraine conflict is viewed as a drain.
A distraction.
A huge distraction. It's consuming resources, attention, diplomatic capital, and in their view, it has to be resolved so they can free up that capacity for the Pacific.
And the sources are pretty clear that the pressure on Ukraine wasn't exactly subtle.
Yeah.
How did they signal to Zelensky that this was non-negotiable?
Oh, the tactics were coercive, no doubt about it. To show they were serious, the U.S. temporarily suspended critical military aid and, maybe even more importantly, intelligence sharing.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was combined with a very transactional demand for any future support. The U.S. was essentially looking to monetize its relationship with Kyiv.
And this is where the analysis gets so revealing. What exactly did the U.S. want from Ukraine in return for its backing?
This is the real nugget. The U.S. reportedly saw ownership of half a full 50% of future revenues from Ukraine's government-owned natural resource assets.
So it's talking minerals, oil.
Critical minerals, oil, natural gas, the reserves that are not yet fully exploited. And this grab specifically excluded current income from places like Naftogaz. So it was a direct bid for a stake in the future of Ukraine's entire resource sector.
That really puts the phrase transactional peace into sharp relief, doesn't it?
It really does.
And all this pressure, it led to the now infamous November 2025 draft 28-point plan. I remember the controversy around this was just immense.
Oh, it was huge. Even U.S. senators were suggesting it was basically a Russian wish list.
Despite the Secretary of State insisting it was 100% U.S. authored.
Right. And that political pushback made sense because the concessions being proposed were radical. They fundamentally reshaped Ukraine's sovereignty. The territorial parts alone were just devastating.
What were they?
The plan suggested recognizing Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk as de facto Russian territory, and then freezing the lines of contact in Kherson and Zaporizhia just right where they stood.
And what about Ukraine's military? What kind of limits were put on its future strength?
Two really critical limitations. First, Ukraine would have to put military neutrality into its constitution.
So no NATO, ever.
No NATO. And second, and this is highly damaging, the plan capped the size of Ukraine's armed forces at 600,000 personnel.
600,000.
Yeah.
Down from their target of what, 900,000?
Exactly. A mandated reduction that basically guarantees Russia a path back to conventional military superiority within just a few years.
And Zelensky's reaction just captured the whole impossible situation, didn't it? He said he was being forced to choose between losing national dignity or risking the support of his most vital ally.
And that quote of his saying, accepting it meant trusting someone who was already attacked us twice. I mean, that just underlines the moral peril of this whole situation.
Okay, so this brings us to the core issue for all of those neighboring countries, for CEC. The risk of these worst-case outcomes suddenly going way up.
Way up. If either scenario 1.1, that's the Russia favorable agreement, or scenario 2, an outright Ukrainian military defeat, if either of those happen, the security for everyone east of Germany just dent. It immediately deteriorates.
So let's dig into that Russia favorable settlement. If Moscow keeps its occupied territory, What kind of security guarantees would Ukraine even be left with?
Well, that's the thing. The scenario suggests that any credible NATO or U.S. guarantees would be off the table.
So what's left?
Probably some kind of neutral international oversight, maybe UN or OSCE unarmed peacekeepers patrolling this vast frozen line of contact.
Which, as the sources remind us, doesn't have a great track record.
A terrible track record. Think about Bosnia and Herzegovina. The peacekeepers there were constrained by these narrow mandates, they were spread too thin, and they just lacked the teeth to actually deter anyone. A setup like that in Ukraine would guarantee Russia opportunities for future disruption.
And that lack of security is terrifying when you pair it with the intel on Russia's ability to rebuild. What are the timelines we're talking about?
This is the data point that should really be focusing minds in CC capitals. If Russia gets a win, either through a deal or on the battlefield, they can immediately start to reorganize. And Western intelligence estimates they'd need only 24 months.
2 years.
Just 2 years after fighting stops to pose a credible conventional threat to a NATO member state.
That is a very, very narrow window for NATO to get its act together. And this is where we have to clarify the threat to countries outside of NATO, right?
Exactly, because NATO members have that 24-month horizon. But the sources suggest the timeline is much, much tighter for non-NATO states. Russia needs only 6 months after fighting stops to pose a credible threat to a neighbor like Moldova or Georgia.
6 months. That dramatically changes the security calculus for the entire Black Sea region.
It changes everything, and almost overnight.
So given those high-risk scenarios, we come back to the current reality, which is scenario 3, the protracted, grinding war. What's keeping that conflict locked in place?
The front lines are mostly static. I mean, the costs for any marginal gain are just extreme. Russia is sustaining its force through more mobilization, through massive sign-up bonuses.
And on the Ukrainian side.
Resilience and self-sufficiency. That's the critical factor. Ukraine is now producing, an estimated 35 to 40% of its daily weapons needs internally. That reduces their dependency.
And the deep dive sources really hammered home the role of asymmetric warfare drones, specifically as the thing that's compensating for Ukraine's manpower shortages.
The figures are just staggering. Drone strikes are now estimated to be inflicting up to 60% of the Russian armed forces' daily casualties.
60%.
It's a critical equalizer. It's offsetting their shortages in artillery, in infantry. It's a major reason Russia hasn't broken through.
So if this grinding war just continues for the next couple of years, what does that actually look like on the ground in the rest of CC?
We have to anticipate that hybrid warfare will continue and very likely intensify. This is Moscow using non-conventional tactics to destabilize NATO's eastern edge.
And we're talking about specific operations here.
Very specific. Things like using unmarked vessels to damage Baltic Sea cables, acts of sabotage against defense companies, sustained cyber attacks targeting energy and transport infrastructure, and, of course, robust disinformation campaigns aimed at elections in Poland, Romania, Czechia.
So with the U.S. signaling this potential withdrawal, Europe is facing a pretty existential question. Can it achieve strategic autonomy fast enough?
And the scale of what needs to be replaced is just immense. The sources estimate that to cover the gap left by the U.S., Europe would need to mobilize another 300,000 troops.
And the cost?
An extra 250 billion euros annually for the next 1 to 5 years. This realization is what's forcing this huge strategic pivot across the continent. Europe has to become Ukraine's primary guarantor now.
Which means a massive financial shift. Is there tangible evidence that Europe is actually committing that kind of capital?
Oh, the commitments are visible and they're substantial. Since 2022, over 60 billion euros in military aid has been committed through things like the European Peace Facility and that 5 billion euro Ukraine Assistance Fund.
That's a collective pot. What about individual countries?
Well, Germany has really stepped up. They're not just meeting the NATO 2% target. They've also legislated a 500 billion euro special defense fund and authorized over $1 trillion in new defense loans.
It sounds like the thinking has really moved beyond just national spending.
Oh,
It's more industrial scale cooperation now.
absolutely. The focus is on integration, standardization. We're seeing plans for maybe 800 billion euros in joint debt just for weapons procurement. And you've got multinational initiatives like Sky Shield, which are integrating air defense systems across the continent. It's a real move toward a continental defense posture.
And what's so fascinating is how this new reality is creating an economic boom for CC And it's often overriding these deep political divides in Europe.
It creates these powerful internal contradictions. German manufacturing is actively diversifying away from cars and into defense, which has huge spillover effects.
Look at Hungary.
Hungary is the perfect example. Their government remains this loud, strategic dissenter in every EU debate, right? And yet the German arms maker Rheinmetall is investing hundreds of millions of euros directly into Hungarian facilities. The money is talking louder than the politics.
And we see a similar thing in Slovakia.
A perfect case study. The Slovak prime minister publicly halts state military aid, but then you see that private arms exports from Slovakia doubled from about 535 million to 1.15 billion euros.
And why?
Because those private exports are getting rich off contracts funded by those same EU mechanisms. The economic engine of this defense pivot is now running almost independently of local political will.
So with all this money, all this industrial effort, what are the main obstacles? What's stopping Europe from quickly consolidating this into a truly credible deterrent?
The problems are all internal. First, you still have uneven defense integration, which slows things down. Second, the member states have very different threat perceptions. They don't all agree on how immediate the Russian risk is.
Which slows down consensus.
And finally, you have these persistent political cohesion issues. Governments acting as strategic disruptors, it's a huge bottleneck. Europe has the resources, it has the will, but it needs political speed to outpace those Russian recovery timelines we talked about.
Right.
So the core tension for security, really, over the next 2 years is simple. Can Europe consolidate all this rising defense spending and political will into a credible deterrent fast enough? Fast enough to mitigate the threat from a regrouped Russia. That speed is what will define the region's stability.
And on the other side of that, it's worth noting the painful shift in Ukrainian public sentiment that the sources reveal. The maximal goals are still there. Pre-2014, borders, reparations, war crimes, tribunals, a big majority still supports those as the official goals. But the 2025 polls show a majority of Ukrainians, something like 69%, now favor a negotiated end to the war as soon as possible. Which doesn't mean they'll compromise on the outcome, but it reveals this exhaustion, a shift in priority from total victory to just stopping the fighting. So let's leave you with the question that really lingers from all this, building on those recovery timelines we discussed. The focus right now is all on protecting NATO's borders because of that 24-month horizon for Russia to pose a threat. But what if that fragile Russia-favorable peace suddenly happens next month?
Then that shorter 6-month timeline becomes instantly relevant.
Exactly. So what's the short-term security calculus for those vulnerable non-NATO states like Moldova or Georgia? What happens if they suddenly find themselves staring down a Russian military that's regenerated far faster than NATO expects? It's a terrifying thought about the short-term cost of long-term strategic fatigue.